On April 28, 1945, deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, Adolf Hitler received news that would seal his fate. His closest ally, Benito Mussolini, the man who had inspired his rise to power, had been executed by Italian partisans. But it wasn't just that Mussolini was dead. It was what they did to his body afterward. His corpse, along with his mistress Clara Petacci, was hung upside down from a metal beam at a Milan gas station. Crowds gathered. They spat on the bodies. They kicked them. They beat the lifeless flesh with sticks and hurled stones. Women fired pistols into the dangling corpses. The Duce, once the supreme leader of fascist Italy, had been reduced to a public spectacle of vengeance, his body displayed like meat in a butcher shop for all of Milan to see. When Hitler learned of this grotesque fate, he went pale. According to witnesses in the bunker, he began trembling. And in that moment, staring into the abyss of his own imminent defeat, Hitler made a decision. He turned to his inner circle and gave explicit, chilling instructions. Under no circumstances was his body to fall into enemy hands. He would not be paraded through the streets. He would not become a trophy. His body must be burned, completely, until nothing remained. This is the story of those final days, when the most powerful dictator in Europe confronted the terrifying reality of his mortality, and how the death of one tyrant directly shaped the suicide of another. Before we dive into those final desperate hours, if you find this deep dive into one of history's darkest moments as gripping as I do, please hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from World War II. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand why Mussolini's death shattered Hitler so completely, you have to understand who Benito Mussolini was to Adolf Hitler. Mussolini wasn't just an ally, he was the template, the original. When Hitler was still a struggling street agitator in Munich in the early 1920s, Mussolini had already marched on Rome and seized power in Italy. Hitler idolized him. In the pages of Mein Kampf, Hitler praised the Italian fascist movement. He studied Mussolini's tactics, his propaganda methods, his use of paramilitary squads to intimidate opponents. The brown-shirted SA stormtroopers who terrorized German streets were modeled directly on Mussolini's black shirts. Hitler kept a bust of Mussolini in his office. He saw the Italian dictator as a mentor, a pioneer who had shown the world that a fascist revolution could succeed. Their first meeting took place in Venice in June 1934, and it was a disaster. Mussolini, at the height of his power, treated Hitler like an unimpressive upstart. The Duce arrived in a magnificent uniform, dripping with medals. Hitler showed up in a plain raincoat and civilian clothes, looking more like a nervous accountant than the future master of Europe. Mussolini mocked him behind his back, calling him a fool, a madman obsessed with race. But Hitler persisted. He needed Italy. And despite Mussolini's early condescension, the two dictators grew closer as the 1930s progressed. By 1936, they had formed the Rome-Berlin Axis, the alliance that would reshape European politics and drag the world into war. What bound them together was more than political convenience. Both men were driven by a toxic cocktail of resentment, nationalism, and the belief that liberal democracy was weak and doomed. Both rejected the post-World War I order. Both saw themselves as revolutionary leaders destined to create new empires. Mussolini dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean. Hitler dreamed of German domination across Europe and the conquest of living space in the East. They fed each other's delusions. They reinforced each other's certainty that history was on their side. In September 1937, Hitler invited Mussolini to Germany for a state visit designed to overwhelm and impress. Mussolini was treated to massive military parades, factory tours showcasing German industrial might, and rallies with hundreds of thousands of cheering supporters. It worked. Mussolini returned to Italy, convinced that Germany was unstoppable. He bound Italy's fate to Hitler's. But the relationship was never equal. As the years passed, Hitler became the dominant partner. Germany grew stronger while Italy struggled. Mussolini's military adventures in Ethiopia and Albania were costly and revealed the weakness of the Italian armed forces. When World War II began in September 1939, Mussolini stayed out, knowing Italy wasn't ready. But after Germany crushed France in June 1940, Mussolini couldn't resist. He declared war on France and Britain, hoping to grab territory and glory off the cheap. It was a catastrophic mistake. Italy's invasion of Greece in October 1940 turned into a humiliating disaster. Greek forces pushed the Italians back into Albania. Hitler had to bail Mussolini out by invading Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941, delaying the invasion of the Soviet Union. Italy's performance in North Africa was equally poor. British forces smashed Italian armies in Libya, and again Hitler had to send Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to rescue his faltering ally. By 1943, the power dynamic was completely reversed. Hitler was giving orders. Mussolini was taking them. The alliance had become a chain around Italy's neck. The Italian people, exhausted by years of war, food shortages, and battlefield defeats, turned against Mussolini. On July 25, 1943, after the Allied invasion of Sicily, the fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested. The Duce was taken into custody and imprisoned on the Gran Sasso, a remote mountain resort in central Italy. Hitler was stunned. He saw Mussolini's overthrow as a personal betrayal and a strategic catastrophe. The new Italian government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, immediately began secret negotiations to switch sides and join the Allies. Hitler wasn't about to let Italy go. He ordered German troops to occupy the country. And in September 1943, he sent a hand-picked team of commandos led by Otto Skorzeny to rescue Mussolini from his mountain prison. The operation was a stunning success. German gliders landed near the hotel where Mussolini was held. Skorzeny and his men stormed the building, overwhelmed the guards without firing a shot, and flew Mussolini to safety. Hitler was elated. He had his friend back. But the man who returned was not the same. Mussolini was broken, physically ill, and psychologically shattered. The fire was gone. He was a puppet now, entirely dependent on German protection. Hitler installed Mussolini as the head of the Italian Social Republic, a fascist puppet state in northern Italy. It was a hollow regime, controlling only the territory the Germans allowed it to hold. Mussolini's government operated from the town of Salo on Lake Garda, and it became known as the Salo Republic. It was a government in name only. Real power rested with the German military. Mussolini spent his days issuing decrees no one followed, watching as the Allies advanced up the Italian peninsula, knowing his end was coming. The man who had once commanded millions now ruled over a shrinking enclave, guarded by German soldiers, despised by his own people. By April 1945, the situation was hopeless. The Allies were closing in from the south. Partisan groups controlled much of northern Italy and were hunting fascist officials. Mussolini knew he was living on borrowed time. On April 25th, with Allied forces approaching Milan and the partisans rising in open rebellion, Mussolini and a small group of loyalists attempted to flee north towards Switzerland or Austria. It was a desperate, chaotic escape attempt. Mussolini disguised himself in a German military overcoat and helmet, trying to blend in with a retreating German convoy. But on April 27th, near the town of Dongo on the shores of Lake Como, Italian communist partisans stopped the convoy at a checkpoint. They searched the vehicles, looking for fascists trying to escape, and they found him. One of the partisans recognized Mussolini despite the disguise. The partisans pulled Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci out of the convoy. They spent the night in a farmhouse under guard. The next morning, April 28th, a partisan leader named Walter Audisio arrived with orders from the National Liberation Committee. Mussolini was to be executed. There was no trial, no formal process, just a decision that he had to die. Audisio took Mussolini and Petacci to a quiet spot near a villa in the village of Giulino da Mezzegra. He ordered them out of the car. Mussolini reportedly said, "Shoot me in the chest." Audisio raised his submachine gun. The first trigger pull produced a click. The gun jammed. He grabbed another weapon from a fellow partisan, aimed and fired. Mussolini crumpled to the ground. Clara Petacci, who had thrown herself in front of him at the last second, was also killed. But death was only the beginning of Mussolini's humiliation. The partisans loaded the bodies into a truck along with other executed fascist officials, including several members of Mussolini's cabinet. They drove the corpses to Milan, the birthplace of Italian fascism, where Mussolini had founded his movement 26 years earlier. In the pre-dawn hours of April 29th, the truck arrived at Piazzale Loreto, a large public square in Milan. This location was deliberate. 5 months earlier, in August 1904, the fascists had executed 15 partisans and displayed their bodies in the same square as a warning. Now the partisans would answer that atrocity. They dumped the bodies on the ground. A crowd began to gather as dawn broke. Word spread quickly through the city. People poured into the square. What happened next was an explosion of pent-up rage and hatred. The crowd surged forward. They kicked the bodies. They spat on them. Women beat the corpses with their fists. Someone fired a pistol into Mussolini's lifeless face. The crowd was frenzied, years of oppression, fear, and loss boiling over into violent catharsis. To control the chaos and allow more people to see, the partisans decided to hang the bodies for display. They strung up Mussolini, Petacci, and several other fascist officials by their feet from the metal girders of a bombed-out gas station. The bodies hung upside down, swaying in the morning air. Thousands of Milanese citizens filed past throughout the day, staring at the grotesque spectacle. Some cheered, some wept, some just looked on in grim satisfaction. Photographers captured the scene. The images were published in newspapers around the world. Mussolini, who had strutted across balconies and declared himself the savior of Italy, was now a battered, inverted corpse on public display, his shaved head and swollen face unrecognizable. The news reached Berlin almost immediately. On April 29, 1945, Hitler was in the Führer bunker, a concrete shelter 27 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. The bunker was a claustrophobic maze of narrow corridors, small rooms, and stale recycled air. The ventilation system hummed constantly, unable to fully clear the smell of diesel fumes, sweat, and decay. Outside, Soviet artillery pounded Berlin relentlessly. The ground shook. Dust and plaster rained from the ceiling. The Red Army had encircled the city and was fighting street by street, block by block, closing in on the government district. The Nazi regime, which had controlled much of Europe just months earlier, now ruled over a few square miles of rubble. Hitler was a physical wreck. He was 56 years old but looked 20 years older. His hands trembled uncontrollably from what was likely Parkinson's disease, exacerbated by the medications his doctor was pumping into him. He shuffled when he walked, dragging his left leg. His face was pale and puffy. His eyes were bloodshot and watery. He had stopped attending military briefings in the upper bunker and spent most of his time in the lower bunker, retreating deeper into his underground tomb. He clung to fantasies of relief armies that didn't exist and counterattacks that would never come. His staff had learned not to contradict him. The atmosphere in the bunker was suffocating, a mixture of false hope, desperation, and denial. It was in this environment that Hitler received the report about Mussolini. The exact details of who told him and his initial reaction vary depending on the source, but the core facts are consistent across multiple accounts. According to Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries who was in the bunker, Hitler was told about Mussolini's execution and the public display of his body. She recalled that Hitler became very agitated and spoke immediately about ensuring his own body would not be captured. Nikolaus von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, also recorded that Hitler reacted strongly to the news and expressed his determination that his corpse would not be exhibited. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister and architect, was not in the bunker continuously during those final days, but he later wrote about Hitler's fear of suffering the same fate as Mussolini. The image of Mussolini hanging upside down haunted Hitler. He could see himself in that position, dragged through the streets of Berlin, put on display in front of the Brandenburg Gate, mocked and desecrated by the very people he had claimed to lead. For a man obsessed with his place in history, with legacy and destiny, the thought was unbearable. He had always believed he was a world historical figure, a leader who would be remembered for 1,000 years. To end like Mussolini, a piece of meat on a hook, a carnival attraction for the mob, was the ultimate negation of everything he believed himself to be. Hitler's reaction reveals something crucial about him in those final days. Despite all his talk of heroic last stands and fighting to the death, despite the propaganda about Götterdämmerung and glorious destruction, Hitler was afraid. Not afraid of death itself, that much seems clear. He had already decided to die, but afraid of humiliation, afraid of being captured alive, afraid of a trial, afraid of his body becoming a symbol of defeat. He wanted control over his ending. He wanted to deny his enemies the satisfaction of parading him through the streets or putting him in a cage. And so, in the wake of Mussolini's grotesque end, Hitler began to finalize the details of his own death. On April 29th, the day after Mussolini's execution, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. He had married Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony after midnight that morning, and now he sat down with his secretary, Traudl Junge, to record his final words. The documents are revealing in their bitterness and delusion. Hitler took no responsibility for the catastrophe he had created. He blamed the Jews for starting the war. He blamed his generals for betraying him. He expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for their treachery, real or imagined. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as head of state and commander of the armed forces. And then he made his intentions clear. In his personal will, Hitler wrote, "My wife and I choose to die in order to escape the shame of overthrow or capitulation. It is our wish that our bodies be cremated immediately in the place where I have performed the greater part of my daily work during 12 years of service to my people." This was not spontaneous. This was a calculated decision, made in direct response to what had happened to Mussolini. Hitler was giving explicit orders about what must be done with his corpse. He repeated these instructions verbally to his aides multiple times over the next 24 hours, making sure everyone understood. His body was to be taken outside, doused in gasoline, and burned. Nothing was to be left for the Soviets. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler said his final goodbyes to his remaining staff in the bunker. He shook hands with the officers, secretaries, and guards who had stayed with him until the end. Then he retired to his private sitting room with Eva Braun. They closed the door. At around 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot rang out. After a moment of silence, Hitler's valet Heinz Linge, along with Martin Bormann and others, entered the room. They found Hitler slumped on a sofa, a gunshot wound to his right temple, a Walther PPK pistol by his side. Blood dripped from the wound and pooled on the floor. Eva Braun was next to him, dead from cyanide poisoning. The smell of burnt almonds from the cyanide filled the small room. There was no drama, no final speech, just two lifeless bodies in a gray concrete bunker, while the Soviet army battled above. The valet and several SS guards immediately carried out Hitler's final orders. They wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them up the emergency stairs to the Reich Chancellery garden. It was dangerous work. Soviet shells were falling all around. The garden was a cratered, smoking wasteland. They placed the bodies in a shallow shell crater near the bunker's emergency exit. Then they doused the corpses with gasoline. They used dozens of jerry cans of fuel, soaking the bodies thoroughly. Someone struck a match and tossed it onto the pile. The bodies erupted in flames. Black smoke billowed into the gray Berlin sky. The fire burned for hours, and the guards periodically threw more gasoline on the pyre to keep it going. Even as the flames consumed Hitler's corpse, Soviet troops were less than 1,000 feet away. By the next day, May 1st, they would be inside the Chancellery itself. The Germans tried to burn the bodies as completely as possible, but they were working under artillery fire, and the cremation was imperfect. When Soviet troops discovered the charred remains on May 4th, there was enough left to identify Hitler through his dental records. But Hitler had gotten what he wanted. There was no public display, no hanging upside down in a Berlin square, no photographers capturing his humiliation. Just ashes and bone fragments in a bomb crater, identified in secret and eventually buried and reburied by Soviet intelligence until his remains were finally destroyed completely in 1970. The contrast between Mussolini's end and Hitler's end is stark and deliberate. Mussolini died at the hands of his own people, partisans who represented the resistance and anti-fascist forces he had tried to crush. His death was public, violent, and symbolic. It happened in daylight, witnessed by thousands, captured on film for history. The display of his body was an act of collective rage and justice, a reversal of all the humiliation fascism had inflicted. Mussolini's corpse became a public reckoning, a moment when the Italian people could physically confront the man who had dragged them into disaster. Hitler avoided that reckoning. He denied the world the satisfaction of seeing him defeated. He controlled his own death, chose the time and method, and ensured his body would not become a spectacle. But in doing so, he revealed his deepest fear. For all his talk of Aryan superiority and the triumph of the will, Hitler was terrified of humiliation. He was afraid of being seen as weak. He was afraid of losing control of his image. Mussolini's death showed him exactly what defeat looked like, and he couldn't face it. So, he retreated into his bunker, surrounded by yes-men and delusions, and took his own life in darkness, alone except for his wife of one day, as the regime he built crumbled to dust above him. The irony is that Hitler's attempt to control his legacy failed completely. The bunker suicide didn't protect his reputation. The attempt to destroy his body didn't erase him from history. If anything, it made things worse. The images of Mussolini at Piazzale Loreto were shocking, but they were also cathartic. They provided closure. People could see that the tyrant was truly dead. Hitler's hidden death, by contrast, spawned decades of conspiracy theories. Some refused to believe he was really dead. Some claimed he escaped to Argentina or Antarctica. The uncertainty became its own kind of spectacle, a grotesque afterlife of rumor and paranoia that Hitler himself would have hated. And yet, in the moment, in that bunker on April 29th, when Hitler learned what had happened to Mussolini, his reaction was purely human. Strip away the ideology, the grandiosity, the speeches, and you're left with a frightened old man staring at his own mortality. He saw his mentor and ally reduced to a carcass swinging from a meat hook, and he understood that the same fate awaited him if he allowed it. Every dictator knows this fear. Every tyrant understands that power is temporary, and that when it ends, the reckoning is brutal. Mussolini learned it in a farmhouse in northern Italy. Hitler learned it vicariously, in a bunker beneath Berlin, and he spent his last 30 hours on Earth making sure the world would not see him broken. The two men, who had risen together on a wave of nationalist fury and contempt for democracy, who had dreamed of new empires and a new order, died within 48 hours of each other. Mussolini went first, publicly executed and humiliated. Hitler followed, a bullet in his head and flames consuming his flesh. Together, they represented the collapse of European fascism. The Rome-Berlin axis, which had terrified the world and plunged civilization into the worst war in human history, ended not with glory, but with corpses, one hanging upside down in Milan, the other burning in a Berlin bomb crater. Both men had promised their followers greatness. They had promised strength, victory, and a new age. In the end, they delivered nothing but ruin, death, and a grotesque finale that symbolized the bankruptcy of everything they stood for. The relationship between Hitler and Mussolini was never one of equals, but it was one of mutual reinforcement. They validated each other's worst impulses. They encouraged each other's delusions. When Mussolini marched on Rome in 1922, he showed Hitler that a fascist takeover was possible. When Hitler seized power in Germany in 1933, he became the dominant partner, overshadowing Mussolini and pulling Italy into a war it couldn't win. By 1945, both men were trapped by their own rhetoric. They had told their people that retreat was betrayal, that compromise was weakness, that death was preferable to surrender. And so, when the end came, they had no way out. They had written the script for their own destruction, and they followed it to the bitter conclusion. For the millions who suffered under their rule, the millions who died in the war they started, the millions who were murdered in concentration camps and occupied territories, the deaths of Hitler and Mussolini were necessary but insufficient. Justice required more than the deaths of two men. It required the complete dismantling of the regimes they built, the prosecution of their subordinates, and a reckoning with the ideologies that made their rise possible. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, attempted to provide that justice, holding surviving Nazi leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. Italy conducted its own purges and trials, though the process was complicated and incomplete. But in April 1945, as the smoke rose from Hitler's burning corpse and Mussolini's body swayed in the Milan wind, the immediate question was simpler. Were they really dead? Could the world finally believe it was over? For those who had lived through the terror, who had watched their countries torn apart, who had lost family and friends to fascist violence, the deaths provided a kind of closure, but the closure was bitter. Too much had been destroyed. Too many lives had been lost. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, just 8 days after Hitler's suicide. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Berlin was in ruins. Millions of Germans were dead or displaced. The Holocaust had claimed 6 million Jewish lives and millions more Romani, disabled people, political prisoners, and others deemed unworthy by Nazi ideology. Italy was shattered, divided, and occupied. The war had killed hundreds of thousands of Italians and left the country's infrastructure devastated. The deaths of Hitler and Mussolini didn't bring back the dead. They didn't rebuild the cities. They didn't heal the trauma. They were simply the final punctuation marks on a catastrophe. What Hitler said and did in his bunker when he learned of Mussolini's fate reveals the psychology of dictatorship in its final moments. These men, who had commanded armies and ruled nations, who had sent millions to their deaths without hesitation, were ultimately consumed by vanity and fear. They cared more about their image, their legacy, their place in history, than they did about the suffering they caused. Hitler didn't spend his last hours thinking about the people he had destroyed. He spent them worrying about his corpse. He dictated instructions about gasoline and cremation. He made sure his aides knew exactly how to burn his body. This was his final act of control, his last assertion of will over a world that had rejected him. And in a sense, it worked. Hitler got the death he wanted. He died by his own hand, on his own terms, in the place he had chosen, with his body destroyed according to his instructions. But he lost everything else. His 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. His dream of German domination ended in total defeat. His capital was captured. His country was divided and occupied. His name became synonymous with evil. No amount of gasoline could burn away that legacy. No amount of control over his final moments could change the verdict of history. Hitler and Mussolini were judged not by the myths they created about themselves, but by the reality of what they did. And that reality was damnation. The story of Hitler's reaction to Mussolini's death is, in the end, a story about the limits of power. These men rose to extraordinary heights. They commanded nations. They reshaped Europe. They started a war that engulfed the world. But when the end came, they were as helpless as anyone else. Mussolini couldn't escape the partisans. Hitler couldn't escape the Red Army. Both died knowing they had lost. Both died knowing their dreams were finished. And both died in ways that reflected the nature of their rule. Mussolini at the hands of the people he had oppressed. Hitler alone in a concrete box, surrounded by the ruins he had created, afraid to face the judgment that awaited him above ground. The images from those final days remain seared into history. Mussolini hanging upside down at Piazzale Loreto, his face swollen and battered, a symbol of fascism's collapse. Hitler's bunker, that claustrophobic tomb where the most powerful man in Europe spent his last days shuffling through corridors, trembling and delusional, before putting a gun to his head. These images are important because they strip away the mythology. They show dictatorship for what it really is, not strength, but weakness, dressed up in uniforms and propaganda. Not destiny, but a dead end. Not glory, but blood and ashes. Hitler understood this when he heard about Mussolini. He saw his own fate reflected in his ally's corpse, and he spent his last hours trying to avoid it. Not because he was brave, but because he was afraid. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of the reckoning. Afraid of being seen for what he really was. A man who had destroyed everything he touched, including himself, and who had nothing left at the end but a can of gasoline and a lit match.